Welcome to the Townsend Center. I'm Stephen Best, the director of the Townsend Center. Can you hear me okay? No? Okay, that's why I asked. Is that a little better? Okay. So we're pleased to welcome two of our colleagues from the Department of Art History, Henrike Lange and Whitney Davis, to discuss Henrike's recent book, Giotto's Arena Chapel and the Triumph of Humility. Henrike holds a dual appointment in the Departments of History of Art and Italian Studies. She specializes in both Italian and European medieval and early modern art and 19th and 20th century historiography, literature, and art in Europe and the United States. Whitney Davis, and I'm going to take a deep breath before I say this, is the George and Helen Pardee Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History and Theory of Ancient and Modern Art. Today's conversation shall be the last in our Berkeley book chats for this spring. Due to a scheduling mix-up, the conversation between Hilton Als and Scott Saul will have to be rescheduled for the fall. So with that, I turn it over to you, Henrike and Whitney. We look forward to your conversation. Thanks.
So I will make a few introductory remarks, and then Professor Lange will give you a presentation of perhaps 10 to 15 minutes to introduce you to the themes of her just published by Cambridge University Press, New York and UK, Giotto's Arena Chapel and the Triumph of Humility. I should say at the outset that I am by no means a specialist in Giotto or even the Italian Renaissance, although I've written a little bit about the work of the great goldsmith and architect Brunelleschi in Florence. But I've had the pleasure of following Professor Lange's project since her job talk at Berkeley some years ago, when fresh from her Yale PhD, which dealt with the Arena Chapel, she presented a sketch of some of the ideas that have now matured in this fantastic book. I'm not going to preview its argument because it's quite an important surprise. Therefore, I'm going to leave the surprise factor to our principal speaker. But this is generally how we foresee this event unfolding. After the presentation, she and I will engage in a chat about some of the concepts and backgrounds of the book. And then, because I know there is a strong interest in this subject among many of you in the audience, we'll turn as quickly as possible to the floor. I will moderate the questions from the floor so that Professor Lange doesn't have to think about that in addition to her own research material. And we will end probably at 1 o'clock. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to you, and I'll get out of the way of the screen.
Thank you, Whitney. Maybe this is the time to dim the light. So thank you. Thank you, Stephen, Michaela, everyone at the Townsend Center. Thank you, everyone, for coming and celebrating this final book chat of the year. Thank you, Whitney, especially the last time, as many of you know, that we stood together engaging in a public conversation about the book was actually my book conference right before the lockdown, which proved so useful for the final version of the book in 2020. So in the book, as you will find, there are two sets of acknowledgements, one written in 2020 when I finished the book, and then an additional note from 2022 specifically for the extended image program and production of the book in lockdown, expressing my gratitude to everyone having supported the project through such a horrific time for everyone. Fast forward 3 years and 2 months from the book conference, we are actually just now grieving the loss of many dear colleagues and friends that supported my book and myself until very recently in so many ways. They are dearly missed, so today is also, like the chapel's own paradoxical theme, a celebration with a full depth of experience of our past 3 years in Berkeley that were filled with such hardship, but also with such grace. Thanks to my students, and I'm delighted to see so many of them here in the room, especially in my Giotto seminar and Dante lectures this spring, But all of my lovely students really before at Yale and Berkeley, to whom I used to say, teaching this material, once the book is out, your questions and reactions to my teaching will have found their way into it. You have helped me continuously question and refocus the many topics involved in my study of the chapel, and to find ever new ways of experimenting with the material, with my ideas, and with the language and delivery of the argument. So just recently, I looked with a friend at a copy of the book contract from January 2020, and the initial conditions actually allotted only a handful of half-tone figures. The only reason that it could be printed in this generous format, and I hope you'll have a chance to look at some of the copies that are going around now, is that the full cycle included, the 200 color plates, all that, is the generosity of the Britannian Alumni Association, who awarded me the 2020 Faculty Award. And with those funds actually made it happen that the book could be published in this format with all figures in color, that amount of figures, but also a price tag that's affordable to students. And so I am immensely grateful. I know some of you are here, and I could absolutely not have done it without you. Thank you so much. Now, to the book, this is the cover. That's the fast forward 3 years, 2 months from the book conference to now, and I will very briefly go into the main parts of the argument. I do realize many of you have not only listened to this many times before, but even read several versions of the book. So I hope this is still going to be interesting, even if that is so in your case. So the chapel is a chapel that we find being constructed in the first decade of the 14th century. And we have the chapel here on a very simple ground plan. That is the first thing I want to point out. We're looking here towards the west, the counter facade with the famous Last Judgment. We have Giotto there showing hell and heaven, being split left and right from the cross, and Christ as the last judge in the center, and then those famous angels rolling up the sky in this apocalyptic moment. Turning around, we see the altar space where we actually have the Annunciation, and we have God and God the Father enthroned, sending out the Holy Spirit for the Annunciation. That all happens on top over the chancel arch. And in between, on the long walls, as you can just a little bit see here, in almost 40 scenes, we see the life stories of the family of Christ. So more precisely, a full cycle of the life of Mary up to the moment of Pentecost and the life of Christ. So those scenes are wrapping around the room from the top to the bottom. And we basically see the chapel then switching gears twice, for the Last Judgment that is painted also in a different style, and then also for the moment of the Annunciation. The reason why I point that out is that the Annunciation is a scene that, as a cycle narrative, falls into the story of the lives both of Mary and of Christ, but they're actually the two moments here with the angel on one side and then Mary on the other in this cubicle, being split into the two sides of the arch, at the same time united by the architectural form, but they're projecting outwards. So they're not like the other scenes kept in this relief-like composition that these other figures have. So I already said relief now. Much of my argument depends on many things that are painted by Giotto as if built in relief. And so in case you have not heard me speak about this chapel and you are wondering what is marble and what is painted here, when I show you this side of the chapel, this is all painted, to just make it short. All of the levels, all of these elements, including these hyper-realistic portraits of the marble in the lower zone, it's all painted. It's a bit more complicated on this side because we actually have two sculptural elements of capitals integrated here. And interestingly, they're right under the Annunciation. So something is going on there with the question of materiality, where the iconography stages the incarnation. And so those were some of the first elements that I noticed in the chapel that made me think very hard about the question of stone relief materiality in that space. Another was that, strangely, this chapel, where the entire interior, we can tell just from its layout and its interior design, really, up to a square inch has been planned precisely. So there is no chance why anything is where it is. Why do we have the strange curve that distorts the upper scenes? That was actually one of the first things I always wondered entering the chapel. And why was this somehow giving us a visual message about the quality of these images that didn't at the time make sense to me? So over the years, I was working on relief and, marble in particular. Now, this is the kind of marble that Giotto creates on the chapel walls. And you see here the streak of the fresco surface that then is, basically obfuscated. You could see this kind of closeness only, almost entering that level. You wouldn't get as close to the surface. So when you are looking at it, it is an eye-deceivingly, realistic, naturalistic, illusionistic rendition of relief sculpture down there. And as I said, marble panels that are portrayed as if they have been, cut from one stone and then arranged in this open book fashion, as often in ancient and Byzantine architecture. But then also these interesting fields where we have relief sculpture that are containing the famous monochromata, the allegorical virtues and vices. And I have brought just these two, hope and strength, fortitude, that are strikingly classical looking, ancient looking in their references as hope to Nike. That might resonate with ancient sculpture, and Hercules, actually, in the form of elements that fortitude is carrying, a lion skin, and also has all these arrows, broken arrows, basically, still sticking out from the scudo Romano. So a Roman shield. This is not a contemporary style of showing a soldier. It's an ancient style. At the same time, these are the most interestingly individualized marble panels. And I like to bring this comparison to the Natural History Museum, where you have all these different actual types of polychrome marble that you can collect and display. I made many years ago, actually, for my job talk here, this collection. This is all marble collected from the walls of the chapel, painted by Giotto. He went through this effort of imagining every single type of marble that he wanted to have represented in the chapel, and then make it individual and special, every single spot, every single one. There's not one part of marble that is generically signifying, as we later know in Baroque churches, that's very often the case. Finally, there is this strange indication of different levels of history through ornament, and that comes into play where we have an ornament that is, ancient garlands, basically, and reminiscent of, maybe mural painting from Bosco Reale or from other places where we have garlands. But that's only in the upper level for the story of the life of Mary. That's the Old Testament. When we come to the New Testament stories, we see actually everything framed in cosmati work. So it's broken marble pieces. All of a sudden, it's an early Christian idiom. The ornament speaks in framing the story of Christ of a different eon, a different time. Finally, just because they're so lovely, these are all the virtues and all the vices together, starting with prudence over fortitude, serenity, justice, faith, charity, and hope, and then all their negatives, basically. These virtues, these vices are spanning a kind of, laying out a battlefield of the soul. So every person entering the chapel is constantly challenged to either go to the one side or the other. And spoiler alert or not, it's pretty obvious that the line of the virtues is on this side, leading to the side of the blessed in the Last Judgment, with hope, as you can see, Nike, hope ascending like this. And in the other side, in the other corner there, we have all the vices leading from folly to despair. That is the chapel so far, with my main, the kind of set of main focal points. Long story short, I came to think about the arch of the chapel. And over an interesting time in my research, then I arrived back in Rome from Padua, which of course is in the Veneto. So I was not initially thinking about ancient Roman monuments, but Giotto had laid those traces and the kind of was breadcrumbing us back to the Roman Forum. And I came to understand much more about what Giotto's work in Rome was also prior to his work in Padua after 1300. And so the reason why I arrived at this arch in particular, which is the Arch of Titus in Rome, is that this also was the arch that was most celebrated and most visited as a church, as a rededicated space there during the Roman Jubilee of 1300. And so there is the sense of appropriation of antiquity, reframing of antiquity, and making it something different. The arch basically was rededicated, a cross entered, like most triumphal arches did receive those crosses, and then it's made a church. So there's a transformative moment in it. At the same time, many of you might be familiar with the imagery that also contains the menorah and brings actually Jerusalem to Rome. So there is an additional layer of these other connections from the Paduan church for Henrike Scrovegni that Giotto builds back to Rome, this forum that had been celebrated in the Jubilee as a focal point of history, where the Roman Catholic Church was celebrating themselves as the victor over pagan antiquity. But conveniently, there's also the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Jewish imagery of the Arch of Titus. And finally, thanks to Stephen Fine's work with the Arch of Titus Digital Restoration Project, that brought me back to think about colors that are the colors lost on these highly damaged relief sculptures within the Arch of Titus. So in the bay of the arch, we have the triumphal chariot relief with Titus here. He has actually lost his head, as has this famed figure next to him, because they were also attacked by iconoclasts. But then they have also lost their colors, and you can see a little bit just here of these traces of colors around some of the figures. Now, Stephen Fine reconstructed some of the colors, and so those are some of the visual aids that I produced, along the years of teaching this, to just indicate what kind of idea I'm proposing there, which is that Giotto, in my view, takes inspiration from the Arch of Titus in some very specific ways and integrates a very simple and brutal military victory narrative, where all you have to do is winning this war and bring the triumph and the people that you captured into the Roman diaspora. And that is the story of this arch. It's a monument of trauma. In the center of the vault, it has the apotheosis of Titus. So it also at the same time states that by military triumph, a human attains the status of God. And so you can see why this arch was not only so offensive to the Jews of Rome, but also to the Christians in that way, and why it had to be rededicated, destroyed, as the iconoclasts thought, but also why it was so offensive still, with Titus on the eagle as the emperor, making himself God through military victory. And so I was looking back then into what the equivalent for this vault would be if I see the Arena Chapel as these two triumphal arches in succession, and why they would be doubled, why there would be a succession, what would be the replacement for Titus in the center. And what we find there are two very prominent apparitions of Mary and the child in one arch, and in the other arch of Christ as Pantocrator. And this made me think about the dual nature of Jesus Christ. So we would have one triumphal arch dedicated to Jesus here in the human, the form really as a baby, but also as the Son of God in the Pantocrator form on this side. There's a little more to that. You might already have seen that the physical framing on the side of Mary and Christ here for the Son of Man side is actual sculpture where, paint again, illusionistically, faux marble sculpture. On the other side, it's this flaming rainbow light apparition. So there is another discourse on materiality, immateriality going on. And I came to think of these two apparitions as the response to the apotheosis of Titus. Finally, the arch was built heavily into medieval architecture in the Roman Forum. So that entire space was filled up over the centuries with other monuments, in that case, actually a family fortress with many towers around the Arch of Titus and Frangipani fortress. And you can see that a little bit here in a much later illustration of this, one 18th century anonymous painting that also shows a little bit of that. But of course, we have not anything left. And so that's another reason why the Arch of Titus had not been anymore considered as an interior, but Giotto saw it as an interior, not as a monument. So the step to a chapel, making a chapel out of that interior is much easier than it would have been for us to decipher it in a way. We do have then the same situation in Padua, actually, for the Cappella degli Scrovegni, for the Arena Chapel, built on the arena, and the chapel is projecting out from that ground plane. So we have the equivalent to what the Colosseum in Rome is, where you have the Roman Forum, the Arch of Titus, and Santa Maria Antiqua, so all the churches in the Roman Forum that are also all constantly working on exercising the pagan past and this ghost of antiquity. You can see that Henrike Scrovegni, when he had this chapel built, he really thought of it as a personal palace chapel, and he had the family palazzo built with it. And I have a full chapter basically on all the reasons why this, would work well with what the Frangipani fortress in Rome does for that family. And to make it short, Scrovegni had basically no pedigree and was trying very hard to establish his family after buying out the bankers and the families that had been established in Padua prior to him. And so there is a kind of reference to that nobility that he was lacking in the Paduan context that might have, been built around his palace and the chapel by making it look like ancient Roman and Frangipani style nobility. This is one of the first photos of the chapel and the arena, and you see that also here at some point, the idea of a triumphal arch had been reintegrated into the Paduan scene, and we finally can think about the processions there. In Rome and Easter, we've just seen that, of course, as well as for the Palm Sunday processions, that the constant reenactment of bringing Jerusalem into Rome in the church year works pretty well with that. Padua had the local ceremonies, usually with an infant angel and an infant Mary walking into the arena. So this was one of the ways in which at some point I started illustrating how all those things work together. And I do apologize if any of this feels like I'm just, referring to a few things. It is a very prismatic argument. There are many, many elements. And that was one of the big challenges in writing the book and finding the best way of delivering the argument, how to line up the elements, where to disclose, each message basically. But to make it short, there is a spatial component, a formal component. There's the historical context that I find very important. And there's iconographies of the theme of triumph and of the theme of humility in that. So finally, it's all also about ruins. The Arch of Titus today looks like that from the side. Giotto could have never seen that because this is where the family had all the family towers. But Giotto would have seen things like this, like the Temple of Cori, that is, near Rome, and things like that were around in Italy. So the idea is really that we can take Giotto seriously with the view up into the sky like that, out of ruins that are standing there and that are in some way commenting up on time, temporality, that passage of time, but also on eternity with that. And that only true triumph that the chapel would then proclaim is that of a triumph of humility that is within the chapel, indeed, this Annunciation arch, where you also have the two only stone capitals that incarnate, have the materialization there, but in the form of faux relief, in this polychrome relief style, with the entry into Jerusalem on a donkey, actually with a foal. There's the baby donkey right here. So there's just, it's all coming with all the endearing details that Giotto left there for us. Luckily, we do also have the record of an inscription that pretty much does make my points here, and you'll find it in the book. And finally, I do touch upon the question of modernity and have been benefiting from some of those more recent books different groups of books around either the medieval modern question or meta painting question. But I also have our friend Tim Clark's book, Heaven on Earth, is an example of more recent engagements with Giotto from an unexpected side as well. So with that, I want to thank you again for being here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's begin with what will come up for art historians right away. Namely, Giotto had worked in Rome and was familiar with the record visible to him there. But most ordinary beholders in Padua would not have been to Rome and probably had little or no awareness of the Roman antiquities of Italy and their specific chronologies and significances in terms, for example, of the Roman imperial conquests in the eastern parts of the Mediterranean. So what would we imagine those beholders who were perhaps nowhere near as literate in all of this material as you yourself are? What would they be taking away from these magnificent frescoes? They could see, of course, the life of Mary and the story of the life of Christ, and that would have been very familiar to almost everybody. But all the more nuanced details, iconographic and symbolic, what do we imagine these ordinary people would have experienced?
Thank you. I think there is one historical difference that we have to take into account, and that's the importance of the Jubilee of 1300, because so many people did, hundreds of thousands did go to Rome, and the scandal of Boniface also, coming up with different ways in which then the, right and, really the ways in which grace is being passed out, were publicized. I think actually word got around. So that is the historical side of it, that I think people were steeped in that Jubilee moment. There is something of that echo of the Jubilee, because it didn't go unnoticed. At the same time, people in a place like Venice without ancient Roman history in their place also constantly try to catch up and reconnect. And it's a bit like the Sienese inventing their own Lupa, not Romana, but then the Sienese version of that. I mean, there is always a translatio imperii discourse that on some level seems to be in place. So I would say that for the larger argument on antiquity, that people would know about that. But I get your point on accessibility of all those details and the different ways in which people could also, maybe not take all of the elements of, what the inscription is, when it talks also about very specific Bible references or Augustinian theology, all that. And I've been thinking about it with this idea of accessibility for the chapel through the virtues and vices that actually have these footnotes, or at least they used to have these inscriptions down there. They're actually rubbed off because that's where people can touch the frescoes and they try to verify if that is painted or if it's sculpture, or, if it's carved. And so this is why, unfortunately, we have lost almost all of the inscriptions under the virtues and the vices. I talk about them as the footnotes to the chapel. And, with that, I would really say there is a high iconography momentum in that this is just for Scrovegni and his elite visitors that have this knowledge. Of course, it's Padua is a university town. Many of the people visiting would also bring that knowledge and interest in it. But there's something else I wanted to say about the inscriptions there, which is that they were also, we think they were sung. And so there is an integration of music and ritual that I think made many of those details intelligible, even without people having read the sources or even knowing the exact historical context, but that there is something in this Gesamtkunstwerk of the chapel in the context of the ritual on the ground of the arena, because that's where they are celebrating that the pagans have left. And I'll just very briefly go into the inscription here. This place known as the arena since ancient times. It continues to affect earthly matters. Places of evil are transformed into honest and godly sites. So there's this obsession about re-engaging with this overcome spirit of the place. This was a vast place of pagans built for a multitude of people. It has been demolished with great fury and abandoned in an astounding manner. And then this replacement of divine virtue of profane vices and celestial joy, substituting earthly pleasure. So I think what they're really trying to do, and Giotto Scrovegni, with their project, are installing is a more specific version of that which everyone still is also dealing with, because as I said, Venice, didn't have those ancient roots, but Patavium, Padua did.
Well, let me then back off the objection about iconography. Let's talk a little bit about Giotto as a painter. This is one of the most well-known monuments in the history of Western art, and its valence has changed, as you know, over the centuries. For the early modern beholders, Giotto's all about this astonishing realism, which in context to them was so surprising and amazing. By the 19th century, Giotto is all about morality. His particular brand of Christian simplicity, as Ruskin saw it. In the early 20th century, Giotto is all about plasticity, the creation of an illusion of solidity and volumetric weightiness from the paint strokes. And today, I suppose, Giotto is partly about what Alex Nagel in his edited volume calls metapaint, painting about painting, meditating on its own means and resources, its own prototypes and possibilities. So given all that, for you, what's the sort of big takeaway achievement of Giotto for you in 2023? Given this historiography and given your own new conclusions about his symbolic work. But just, this is kind of a soft little question, but what's his claim to fame as an artist for you now?
Yes, I'd like to say, with the emphasis on meta painting, I agree that that has been, in recent years, I put the Berkeley book there as well on the site. I mean, that has been a main interest. Meta painting, I would like to extend that from the side of Italian studies into literature in a way, and also say there are really interesting ways in which Giotto's chapel can be seen as a text or in conversation with other texts. So I'll add that as a footnote to the meta painting there. But I think the meta painting question also contains the materiality, naturalism, and morality questions also.
So
And
just for the audience's sake, could you give us a particular spot in the program where you see Giotto thinking about his processes as a painter and inserting a kind
yes,
of meta pictorial element into the program?
I can in two spots, but I can probably not show them right now on the slides because they're up here. One of them would be, and now I will respond in two parts to that, because one is about the painting process of how he applies the paint and what that looks like. The other one is going to be about the content of the form in a way again. But the one answer there for the painting is in the Massacre of the Innocents, he sprinkles the blood of the babies on top of those bodies. So that there's a kind of spontaneity of the paint on it. He does a similar thing here with some of the processes for the imitation marble. So he does include one element of the paint also just speaking freely in a way, So he, in all his precision that he puts out for the ornaments here, those are the very few moments where something is not hyper-regulated or predictable. In other places, though, to really say more about the achievement there, or what is so striking about him is how he integrates antiquity in a way that is so subtle that a lot of the things that I found in the chapel have been overlooked over such a long time, including the reference in the chasing of the moneylenders from the temple. This is up here in the scene. You'll actually find it in the book. So anyone who's sitting next to the copies of the book can look it up. There's this little child holding up a dove that is, in this center of the turmoil. Jesus is throwing over the tables with the sacrificial animals and all that, and so everyone is upset. This little child is holding a dove to her chest, and there's this ancient sculpture from the Capitoline Museum doing the same thing, but with a hand up like this. And Giotto takes this figure and from ancient Roman sculpture, but splits the two elements in that. So the gesture of the child holding the dove appears, and right behind that little child stands one of the disciples doing that gesture with a hand. So there is a subtlety and a kind of rethinking of all the references that also hide many of the references, because it's not just entering one figure as it is, but he looks back at what would a child really react like, and it would not hold the dove with one hand and then dramatically raise for effect, the other hand, but it would actually hold it fast and steady with both hands so that it doesn't fly away. And he also understands the pictorial brilliance of this gesture. And so he puts the disciple with the gesture behind it, and he gets both out of it. So there is a freshness of how he integrates the historical material and models that he chooses in Rome. And that is the side of history from antiquity to Giotto, but then there's Giotto up to now. And again, with many thanks to my students here in the room, in the Giotto seminar this semester, we have been finding still new things, and things I had not, that are not even in the book that I hadn't considered. And so I do think that there is still a wealth of these subtleties and elements in the chapel. And that for me is also in a way the modernity, and where all the different elements of naturalism and meta levels come together.
So one more question for me, and then we'll go to the audience. One of the often most remarked formal features of the Arena Chapel paintings is the famous blue. The blue which you analogize to the vaulted sky. But in fact, the naturalistic representation of the sky is this other blue.
Mhm.
It's not the saturated blue.
Yeah.
So that kind of disparity has occasioned a lot of interpretations of Giotto's blue. What's your take on that particular matter now, after you've finished all your work? Is it simply an illusion of the intensity of the sky itself, or is there something else going on, as some philosophers and others have argued?
Yes, I think Giotto keeps us on our toes with the artificiality of that kind of blue, because the blue that Whitney has pointed out in the back of the Coretti. So I should maybe just explain for everyone that there's also two fictive rooms here, and we call them the Coretti. It's like little choir spaces adjacent. They're not there. That's just wall, and it's painted so as if that's opening into additional rooms that could be, in a different church, would be perfectly likely to have a room there, a space for more tombs or a little additional interior. And that is where Giotto shows the celestial blue, and Roberto Longhi, thank you so much. He talks about that as that being the blue really that is outside, that comes in from the Giardini. And I think that is the big hint that all other blue has to be seen as this this kind of artificial blue that structures the life experience of Christ and Mary in their narrative scenes. And I think it's not by chance that then this is also the artificial blue and not the realistic blue, because we are not looking, when I say we're looking out of the ruins, we are, but we're looking at also stars. We see the night sky, and then we have these apparitions of Mary and Christ come in. So there is another way in which Giotto is making it more realistic at the same time by breaking the space open and just leaving the transverse arch in the middle. But there's the artificiality of the deep dark blue that he has already shown as the blue behind the historical scenes. And then there's the structure of the stars that are not scattered. And Giotto, as Dante knew what the stars looked like, he knew that this is a pattern of stars that is saying cosmos, and that gives you not the illusion of actually looking through. So he's kind of constantly going back and forth with the illusionism, and we see, I think, in the Last Judgment why he does it, because he puts the apocalyptic angels at the very top of this whole story. There is sun and moon, and those are actually in realistic key, so they're not symbolic. They're actually supposed to be there. And there's an apocalyptic angel here, another one there, rolling up the idea of the fresco ground. So it's maybe a bit small to see now in the back, but those angels are standing there and they're rolling up a slice of the background on either side, and behind them there are these closed doors, as we often think to heavenly Jerusalem. So it's basically them saying, well, let's take off this realism that you produced as a painter, but then what's the real story, the real vision still is behind closed doors. And that's basically like Dante at the end of the Divine Comedy, stepping back from language, stepping back from trying to say what's real, after having actually gone through the entire circle of stating what reality, materiality, all of those things are, to say there's a truth, reality, hopefully a justice beyond this world that's not palpable. And you see how my argument runs there. The very fictitiousness of relief, the faux relief quality would be the warning of saying this is Giotto, might do that, but he does do it so that we can understand it as not the real thing. And I think it's a constant back and forth that the blue really serves as well.
let's go to the audience in the remaining few minutes we have. Question. Yes, sir.
Very, very exciting. But as a literature person, I was intrigued by your comment that Giotto's in dialogue with other literary works. I wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Yes, I was, spontaneously only saying that there are texts, intertexts, textualities within the chapel. There is actual text in the chapel with these inscriptions under the virtues and vices. So there is a footnoting mechanism there. And again, that binds back into, or feeds back into music and into ritual. I will say the literary references, there are many, there are, manuscripts that later refer also to the chapel. But the big problem is that association of Dante and Giotto that historiographically has been promoted throughout the 19th century on the basis of a 40 record on them having been friends and having been spending time in the chapel while Giotto was painting, and Dante came in and suggested certain ideas. And so there is this whole fantasy of the 19th century historiography on that. Whereas we can see chronologically, but also by looking at the works that in connecting the Arena Chapel and the Divine Comedy, it would be the other way around. And of course, as an art historian, I'm happy to accept that there can be the artwork that is visual that might actually have had more relevance for the written work that Dante might have actually seen Giotto make this and then thought about relief in Purgatory 10 and make the reliefs of humility there exactly what they are for that reason, because humility, virtues, and relief and antiquity are the ingredients for this chapel. They are for Purgatory in Dante's Divine Comedy, but we have to reverse this idea of the literary genius is the only one who can conceive the idea, and then the painter comes in and he illustrates it. I think in this case, if we want to find that relationship, it would be the other way around. But what I also have in my book, and this is thanks to Stephen Botterill and the work he has done on Divulgare Eloquentia, is that I think that is the text for the chapel, because that is where we have stylistic elements, we have thinking about history, we have thinking about Latin, Roman history in relation to the vernacular. And those are all the style levels that we have visually in this chapel. And so I think Divulgare Eloquentia and the Bible and Augustinian texts on the vision of God are what makes the chapel in Giotto's cosmos, and then that feeds into the Divine Comedy. I would maybe make that hypothesis.
Any other questions or comments?
How public was the chapel? Who would have had access to see it?
Thank you for asking that. And this reminds me, I meant to say that earlier, Whitney, and for some reason you got me off the meta with the meta painting. I wanted to say there is a split in audience, and there probably was a choir screen. There was a way in which the chapel that, I hope I have convinced you, really is split into these two halves. In the middle, there probably was a kind of barrier, and there would have been not only different audiences, but different privileges for different audiences. So the general public would enter through this door from the arena and come in and only be allowed to go up to this point. Now that, incidentally, is the point where the illusion is the greatest. And so actually the general public would not have access to see, as Scrovegni and his visitors in the privileged part that has the special entrance door from Scrovegni's palace, to see how the relief illusion collapses when you actually leave the most ideal point of view. And so there even is a differentiation in that. But in general, it was very public. The chapel was set up to grant indulgences very early. And so Scrovegni's idea was that was supposed to be a family chapel for public consumption to elevate the family name. I think we can we can safely imagine. He definitely thought of that as a church that should be integrated on the pilgrim's path, that when people came to Padua for the Santo, then they should also come to his chapel. And it is a big PR project, really.
Question over there?
What elements of Giotto do we see today in like modern Christian architecture, art, if at all? Like what influence?
Well, I mean, you know, we have Rothko with the chapel. I mean, there are, you know, modernist versions of Giotto actually all throughout the 20th century. Interestingly, I'm now thinking of this chapel here on Shattuck that is, you know, has the same form, but absolutely no images. But the chapel is made of, you know, made with a wooden vault. So I've been thinking about that a little bit, that you know, the humility of the material, that would be something that modern art, I think, takes from that. In terms of church architecture, you know, I have had conversations with architects that are now, you know, building monasteries and cathedrals, and they are, you know, very much in tune with this whole argument with a chapel and an arch, because they think about this interior as a, you know, as a spatial entity. So they immediately see when I start the presentation, you know, what I will be saying there, but they also, in their own practice, build their churches the same way as making references, but references in an architectural iconography, so that sometimes it's not just the narrative or the scene or the allegory, but it's the entire space and its configuration that recalls the experience of a different space. And that I still, you know, hope would also have been the strongest element for the pilgrims, no matter how versed they were in all the literary historical details, but to just enter that and have the feeling, yeah, this is like walking through a triumphal arch. And there would have been many more arches still in Italy at the time, half ruined. So there was more of a corpus of references. Thank you for the question.
If you're interested in Italian modern, Morandi is a great file of the early 18th century. So I learned a lot looking at his still lifes, helped me to see Giotto actually.
Thank you. And that's the entire Valori Plastici movement also. Cézanne, I mean, there is a whole, and you know, I have not even, we have unfortunately left out Ruskin now and the pre-Raphaelites, but there are, of course, all of those references. Thank you.
I think we have run out of time. So thank you very much for that.